Good afternoon. My name is Annmarie Weisman. I'm with the Department of Education, accompanied by my colleague, David Bartnicki. We're here to present on SAP, Satisfactory Academic Progress. We hope that in such a large room, of course, everyone has a seat, but that you'll join us a little closer to the front. There are plenty of seats up front for those interested, especially in this section over here. If you're first coming into the room, there are plenty of seats up front, plenty of seats overall. As we get started, we wanted to review the regulatory citation for Satisfactory Academic Progress. As many of you know, these regulations were enacted in October on the 29th of 2010, and they were effective on July 1st, 2011. So we don't have a lot new to share with you, but we know that this is a topic of concern for many people, and many people are looking to enhance what they're doing, do it a little better. Maybe you're considering changing policy, so we want to start back at the beginning with the regulation. Previously, SAP regulations were in 3 different locations, and part of what this rulemaking did was to consolidate them into one area. SAP regulations are now located all in 668.34. From Section A, we have the policy statement that talks about establishing a reasonable SAP policy to determine whether otherwise eligible students are making progress in their educational program and eligible for Title IV aid. We want to emphasize the idea of being reasonable and also the idea of applying this policy consistently among your students. We do tell you that you can have groups of students, so you don't have to have the same SAP policy for all of your students. But we want to talk more about that coming up in terms of how you might do that. We also want to remind you that when you're doing SAP, it needs to apply to all of the Title IV programs at your institution. So you cannot say that a student would be eligible for Pell but not loans, or for loans but not Pell. It applies to all of your Title IV programs. We also say that in these regulations, we've given you a lot of flexibility at the institution level. We provide the outline, and you fill in the details. So this flexibility will be pointed out to you in many areas. When the regulatory effort happened, a lot of people were saying SAP just got stricter, and we really didn't. In many ways, we loosened it to allow you more flexibility. And again, we'll point out that flexibility as we go through. We want to first talk about the concept of as strict as or stricter than. We talk about having a SAP policy in your financial aid office that it is as strict as or stricter than your other policies. Usually schools might have an academic SAP policy that might be different from the financial aid policy. So here, when we talk about this, we're talking about the measurements that you use to monitor for SAP. So that is a qualitative and a qualitative standard. We talk about usually GPA measures the quality of the education, and then we talk about pace of progression toward maximum time frame. We'll go into each of those a little more deeply throughout the presentation. We do want to remind you, though, that when you're talking about the as strict as or stricter than, we're not talking about how often you check SAP. So if you have an academic office that monitors progress every term, at the end of every term or payment period, and you in the financial aid office want to check annually, you are permitted to do that. And that still meets our policy and our regulations. As we've talked about these regulations, we've gotten a number of questions about different policy issues, and one of them is the idea of having different policies. So people will say that they want to have different categories. You can do that. You can have a measurement where you're looking at one SAP policy for your full-time student and one for part-time. Maybe you have a different policy for undergraduates and graduate students. Or maybe you even break it up if you're a school that has a lot of different graduate disciplines. If you have a medical school, a dental school, a vet school, they might all have different SAP policies that they have for their program, and that's fine. We do say that you can't do that to discriminate in any way. So you can't say that there's a different policy for men and women, for athletes versus non-athletes, or for veterans, or for any other type of group that could be seen as discriminatory. You might say even that you want to do something for first-year students that's a little different. You might have graduated standards, and we'll talk about that coming up as well. We've highlighted for you at the bottom of this slide the website, the Program Integrity Q&A that gives you a little bit more information about some of these topics, and that's on IFAP. So you check that out if you have not seen those before. There's a lot of different questions and answers that have come up over time with this topic as well as others from that rulemaking. We want to talk about the idea of evaluation items. Each time you do a formal SAP check for financial aid purposes, you're checking multiple things, and you need to do all of these things in order to have it count as an actual SAP evaluation. So you're looking at the first item, which is the qualitative measure, and typically we think of that as grades or your GPA. We want to highlight that remedial coursework you can do a separate or have it integrated into your regular qualitative measure, and we'll talk about remedial coursework again coming up shortly. We also want to remind you of the quantitative measure. We talk about that as being the pace of progression, and that's heavily related to the maximum time frame. Again, we'll evaluate each of these separately in just a minute, but we want to remind you again that this is the components that you need to do, but they all make up your SAP check. So you decide whether you want to do this at the end of every payment period or if you want to do it annually for your students. Your policy has to describe certain things in order to be an acceptable SAP policy. If you're not sure how to put together a SAP policy, if you're new at your institution or you're looking to change, I highly recommend the FSA assessments. They're located on the IFAP website under one of the boxes when you first open up the homepage under Tools for Schools. They have different learning activities, links to regulations, and different items spelled out for you so you can create your own new SAP policy or alter the one that you already have. One of the things that you need to include is how your SAP policy is affected by 4 key things, and that's incomplete grades, withdrawals, repetitions, and transfers of credit. So for example, we highlight that for withdrawals, you can't exclude W's earned past an add and drop period. That was a question that we got frequently. If it's after your add drop period and it's on that student's transcript, you need to include that as a course that's attempted. For repetitions, we in this rulemaking also changed our standards for repeat coursework. And so we want to make sure that you include in your SAP policy how you address repetitions as related to SAP. So we say that you can pay more than one time. Now you can pay one additional time for a previously passed course. We want to hear in your SAP policy if you are counting both of those or if you're counting just one of those. You need to address that, as well as on the flip side, if a student fails a course, how are you looking at those repetitions? Are you counting both attempts? Are you counting only the last attempt? So make sure you make a note of that in your SAP policy. And then for transfers of credits, we want to make sure that you understand that anything that you're accepting toward completion of the student's program needs to be included as both hours attempted and hours completed. Now, it's your option as to whether you're going to include anything in your SAP policy that is not being accepted toward a program. Some people prefer to do it that way, and some people prefer to leave it out. If you are a school that gets many, many transfer credits, you'll want to look at a few examples of how that might impact your students and make your selection, and make sure you include that in your SAP policy. We've also gotten those questions on non-accepted credits. So we say that regulations require credit hours accepted toward a program count as both attempted and completed when you're calculating PACE. So the question we get is, what about those non-accepted credits? And as I just mentioned, you can accept those, you can use those even if you're not accepting them, but our regulations don't say how you need to treat that. So you can say in your policy how you wish to do it. If you want to say anything on the student's transcript counts, and we're going to use that, then you can use that. But again, you need to consider the ramifications if you have someone who transfers in a lot of classes, what that might do for your SAP policy, especially as related to maximum time frame. If you're counting all of those credits and the student has only a small number left to take at your institution, that may work fine. But if the student is starting at the beginning at your institution and not really transferring a lot in, that can have a significant impact on maximum time frame. Looking in more detail at the qualitative measure, we want to remind you of our definition, and that's assessing the quality of academic workload using standards that are measurable against a norm. And what that really comes down to for most of you would be grades. Most of you, I'm pretty sure, would use a GPA to define your qualitative measure. We want to remind you that for our purposes for a SAP check, our regulations require that you use a cumulative standard here. So you're looking at the cumulative standard from our perspective in terms of checking for SAP. Now again, you can use multiple ways of doing this, and if you want to be more restrictive and you want to impose a semester or a term requirement or a payment period requirement if you're a clock hour school, you can certainly do that. That is your option. We talked about the idea of graduated versus fixed standard. Some schools will say that they like to give first-year students a break and perhaps give them a little more leeway when they're coming in, get adjusted to school, so they give them a standard of, say, 65% that they need to meet, or maybe even 60% toward their pace of progression. It may be that then later they build that up and they say by the second year you need to be completing, if they start at 60, they might say, well, then we'll go to 65% for a maximum time frame calculation. And then they look for 70% by the time they're a third-year student. You can have that kind of a standard, or you can say, we require 67%, which is our minimum that you can have in order of meeting that 150% time frame. We'll say that you can do that and say a flat 67% for all of your students, or you might impose 70%. But you can set that as a fixed standard throughout and tell students that's your policy and that's what they need to meet. We talked earlier about remedial coursework, and so people often ask how that's treated for SAP purposes. I'm going to point out again, this is an area of great flexibility for you because we tell you part of it that you need to do, but then part of it that where you have options. And I think that when we give you the ability to do options, you should always take us up on that. Use it to the ability that benefits you and your students. Do it in a way that's going to help them and meet the needs that you have and your specific student body. So we tell you that you may, but you're not required to include remedial coursework in determining that pace of progression. Remember, think about the point behind pace of progression. We're telling you that a student should be on a track to complete their academic program. And when we put out the idea of an academic program, when you put that in your standards and you say how many credits or how many clock hours a student is expected to earn, you probably didn't envision remedial coursework in there. So if you're saying that you have a 150% maximum time frame to complete, you may decide you're going to exclude the idea of remedial coursework in that calculation because the student really wouldn't be at the same advantage that someone coming in without the requirement to do remedial coursework would have. Think about how it works at your institution. Think about how prevalent remedial coursework is and how much remedial coursework the student typically needs. Decide for yourself and for your office what is the best way to go here. We do say that you are required to evaluate remedial coursework under the qualitative factor. So even though it doesn't have to be part of your GPA, you have to have some measurement that evaluates the progress a student is making in that remedial coursework. And that could be that you grade on a pass-fail, and so at the end of a payment period, you look and see if somebody has remedial coursework, and you say, did they pass it? Did they meet the course requirements? Some schools grade remedial coursework through something called MP, which is making progress. That's fine with us. Again, we're giving you flexibility. Do what works best for your students and for your office. We also have gotten a lot of questions about the idea of programs that are greater than 2 years. How does the qualitative portion of a SAP review relate to a requirement for a student to have a GPA of at least 2.0 or academic standing consistent with the institution's requirements for graduation? Here, the Higher Education Act requires a specific qualitative review at the end of the student's academic year. So people have asked us then, what does that mean at the end of the second academic year? We have students that go full-time, we have students that go part-time. In this sense, I think we've done this to make it easier for the offices to review. We've said that for the student being at school either 4 semesters or 6 quarters, regardless of enrollment status, that is where we consider that you have to have a GPA of at least 2.0. And if you're not using semesters or quarters and you're using clock hours, we would say then consider the equivalent. Now, many of those programs are shorter than 2 years, and so it's not as relevant there. We see it, though, a lot more with credit hours and students going part-time. So look for your students after they've completed what would be the equivalent of 2 years of full-time study, and we would say at that point, make sure that they have the 2.0 or higher. We would certainly hope for higher. The quantitative measure, as we mentioned before, is progressing toward program completion. Our goal here is that the student completes your program and graduates. We want to remind you again that the program here, we're talking about a cumulative standard. So again, graduated or fixed, you can decide how you are implementing this. We're giving you that flexibility once again. You can be more restrictive, and if you choose to have something that is based on your payment period, you might say you have to meet this standard at the payment period level, you have to meet this standard for the cumulative. As long as you have that cumulative review, that counts as a quantitative measure for our purposes. We talked earlier again about pace of progression required to make sure that student is on track within the maximum time frame. So here is how you would calculate pace of progression. We're looking at the cumulative number of hours completed over the cumulative numbers of hours of attempted. So for clock hours, you're looking at clock hours required to complete expressed in calendar time, and typically that is weeks. For credit hours, of course, it's much easier just looking at the credit hours as they stand. A school can use rounding rules when calculating, and when we talk here about rounding rules, we're saying anything from a 0.5 or higher can be rounded up to the next percentage point. So whether you're at a clock hour or a credit hour program, you can round 66.5% up to 67% as an example. So rounding is optional, but you would want to state in your policy whether you do rounding or not. You would be surprised how many people call us and say, well, we don't have anything in our standards. What if I do it for one and not the other? We would heavily caution you that you want to be treating everybody the same. So if you round for one program, round for another. If you round for one student, you're rounding for another. You just want to make sure that you're consistently applying these standards. And I would encourage you, if you don't have anything in your policy about rounding, to include something the next time that you update it. We have, again, on that Program Integrity Q&A website, under the SAP topic, question R-Q9 for a clock hour example that goes into a lot more detail on this issue. For maximum time frame, the limit on maximum time frame for undergraduate programs is 150% of the published length of your educational program. For graduate school, for any graduate program of study, the school gets to define the maximum time frame based on the length of your program. We gave an undergraduate level example here, the typical bachelor's degree being 120 credits for completion. So 120 times 150% is 180 attempted credits. So that is your maximum time frame. Now keep in mind, this is only an example. It's the most common one because it's the most generous that we allow under our regulations. And so that's what we typically see schools doing. But that's not to say that you could not be stricter than our requirements. I knew a school that said, we have very high academic standards. We want to say that students need to complete within 125%. We don't want them to get too far out in terms of time, and that is our choice, right? Yes, it's absolutely your choice. I would caution you away from the 100% option. It's certainly your option, but what we find are people who think they're being very strict academically and they think it sounds really good up front, and then they start wanting to make all kinds of exceptions because they realize it doesn't work. Somebody becomes ill. They might be your brightest student in the class, but you can't let them finish because you have a SAP policy that's that restrictive unless you do an appeal. And we don't go into a lot of detail here about appeals, but keep in mind that in the past there seemed to be some talk that appeals could not be done on the basis of maximum time frame. That is not correct. You can do an appeal based on this issue, but you need to do some things to document how the student is getting toward graduation. Because remember, our goal here, again, is completing the program and getting that student toward graduation. So the quantitative measure is tied to maximum time frame. You're looking at, again, our example here of 120 credits divided by 180 credits of your maximum time frame, and you get to 66.6%, which typically we would round, and we talk about 67%. So that's your student needs to complete 67% of the credit hours or clock hours attempted. We want to remind you that every time you're doing what is a SAP check for our purposes, for federal student aid purposes, you need to include that maximum time frame review. So the student is ineligible at the point where it's clear they will not meet the maximum time frame. So not when they actually meet it. And we give you an example of that here because this does cause a little bit of confusion. If at the end of a payment period, or what we're calling a SAP evaluation checkpoint, the student has attempted 160 credit hours out of their possible 180, and they have 25 left to complete their degree, they're not meeting SAP because they exceed that maximum time frame. Even though they're not in the payment period where they would actually lose eligibility, we would say it's not mathematically possible for them to ever meet SAP. So we would say that they are now ineligible for aid. Again, this can be subject to appeal, but that's if you have an appeal at your institution, and that is optional. So we want to make sure that you do understand how that works and when they specifically lose eligibility. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to David for the remainder of the presentation, and once we finish, we'll have plenty of time for questions for both of us.
Well, thank you, Annmarie. My name is David Bartnicki, training officer out of the Atlanta region, and I just have to say, wow. I did not think that there would be over 1,000 people that would like to talk about SAP, but you guys have exceeded my expectations. I was a little worried when they gave us this big room, but you guys have filled this up nicely. Also, I've always wondered what it felt like to be Jeff Baker, and it feels pretty good. Feels pretty good up here. But I'm so happy to have a colleague training with me. In fact, Annmarie was my former boss in training, so it's always nice to be training with a higher up and a former boss. Always makes me feel very comfortable up here. So, so if you do have any questions, we'll just defer to Annmarie. No, just kidding. So with that, let's talk about checking SAP. We get questions about this a lot at different times. We have to remember that when you're checking SAP, we specifically say that you have to check at the end of a payment period. So that is when the official checkpoint will occur. Now, I have some schools that like to check more frequently, and by all means, we appreciate the work that you're doing with your students, especially those that might need a little more help along the way. You want to stay on top of them. Just remember, if you're checking in the middle of a payment period, in the middle of a term, those are unofficial checks. You cannot take any kind of sanction against a student if it is not the official SAP checkpoint. However, it does give you that ability to let them know that they're on thin ice or there's potential problems so that you can work with them. So hopefully by the end of that payment period, when you do have that official checkpoint, they've done what they need to do to improve. At least that's what we hope. So we want to make sure that you're aware of that. Talk about clock hours. I won't ask for a show of hands because I won't be able to see all my clock hour friends out there. But we can't forget that SAP applies to all different types of programs, and clock hours being one of them. As Annmarie mentioned, we give you a little flexibility at different points, and this is one of them for our clock hour programs. One of the areas specifically is, well, at what point am I going to check SAP for my clock hour programs? You actually get to decide when that payment period for SAP purposes actually ends. So is it going to be the point where the student has reached the scheduled clock hours? Just the scheduled hours that he's supposed to be at that point. That's one point where you could say this is the end of the payment period. Is it at the point where the student has actually attended the number of clock hours that make up your payment period? Or is it number 3, at the point where the student has successfully completed the clock hours in the payment period? Now, you can choose any one of those. Be consistent in your policy. All students in that program will be treated the same. Remember that this definition of the end of a payment period is for SAP purposes only. This does not apply to when can I disperse my Title IV aid. That would still follow under our normal payment period definitions for dispersing of Title IV aid. This is strictly for SAP. The program Q&A, again, question R-Q9 goes into quite a bit of depth on our program integrity Q&A webpage off IFAB that talks about this area. Not to forget our friends in the non-term credit world. I have some schools that are so lucky. They have standard, non-standard clock hour and non-term credit. Wow. They never go to sleep. They're just always busy. But we have to remember non-term credit is going to be, again, at the end of a payment period. Well, when does that occur for SAP purposes? It's going to occur at the point where either the student was scheduled to have earned the credit hours, or at the point where they actually successfully complete those credit hours. So at the point where they've actually passed the hours in question. So you have some flexibility. Choose which option works for you, be consistent, apply it to all students in the same program. Now, how often do you have to check SAP? In part, that's going to be dictated by the length of your programs. For any programs that are 1 academic year or less, you must check at the end of each payment period. Okay? Now, if you think about it, a very small program, you might only be checking it once, maybe twice, depending on the number of payment periods that make that up. But that's for programs equal to or less than an academic year. For all your other programs that are greater than an academic year, we say that you must check at least once annually. And for us, annual means once in a 12-month period. Okay? Now, even if you can check once annually, you are always welcome to check more frequently. So if you choose to, you could check at the end of each payment period or each term in your program. When you're, again, evaluating SAP, checking SAP, as Annmarie mentioned, you're looking at the qualitative, the quantitative, the max time frame. We're trying to see, is the student progressing as they should in their program of study, okay? You may have warning or probation periods. If you do, remember they are only 1 payment period. Okay? That's all they can ever be, 1 payment period. But if you do use a warning or probation, please make sure your definition is consistent with our regulatory definitions. I often will work with some schools where they'll say, oh, the student was on probation, and they mean something totally different than what we're expecting. So in our regs, we actually do define warning and probation, and our program reviewers and auditors, that's what they're going to be focusing on, our definitions. If someone loses eligibility and you want to suspend them or terminate them, we don't care what you call that. We don't have a definition for that, so you get to make up something for that one. But warnings and probations, we clearly want you to follow our definition. Who gets to use a warning period? This is where it matters how often you check SAP. You're able to use a warning period if you monitor SAP at the end of each and every payment period in your program. That includes summer for those of you that are more traditional. Okay? But it's optional. You don't have to have a warning period. You may. Okay? So again, you have some flexibility. Remember that this warning period is only 1 payment period long, but the positive of a warning is there's no appeal. So this is a student who technically is not meeting SAP. They are failing one of the measurements or more, and yet they can continue to receive Title IV aid without having to appeal because they're in this warning period. That's the benefit of checking SAP each and every payment period. Now, it is possible for a student to receive more than 1 warning period throughout their academic career at your school. It just cannot be consecutive, okay? Because at the end of a warning period, which can only be 1 payment period, I'm either now meeting SAP or I'm not. And if I'm not, then that's a different route we have to take, potentially going through probation, appeal, and so forth, or I'm now meeting it, which means I'm in good standing, okay? But if I'm on a warning period and I pull up my grades and now I'm in good standing and later down the road I struggle again, well, I might be placed on a warning again. Your policy will dictate whether or not those students can be placed on warnings. You can limit How many warning periods exist for your students? Some schools say just one. Some say indefinite as long as they meet the requirements. Some have a number. Again, you have flexibility. Just make sure it's clear in your policy. Talk about probation. So now we have a student who technically, again, is not eligible for Title IV aid. They are suspended, terminated, whatever you might say from Title IV aid, and the only way they are going to continue to be able to receive Title IV aid is through an appeal process to be placed on probation. Probation is, again, optional. Believe it or not, I actually have some schools in my region that do not have probation. It's you either meet it or you don't. Now, that's extremely restrictive, but again, they have that ability. Most of my schools, though, have some form of a probation. If you have a probation, the student must appeal, and the student must be approved. Now, I would caution you in this appeal process and overall SAP, it is an area that auditors and program reviewers love to focus on. It is one of the big Title IV policies out there that we like to monitor with our schools. So you want to make sure if you have probation, that you have a robust policy that talks about it. Not only do they have to appeal and be approved, but then one of two things must be true. To be placed on probation, either mathematically it's possible for them to meet the SAP standards at the end of the probationary period, which again can only be one payment period, or you've placed them on an academic plan, and that academic plan has a specific point in time that will end. If you're developing an academic plan, again, it's your choice. I have schools that choose not to develop academic plans. That's okay. But that means the only way they can be placed on probation is if it's mathematically possible for them to meet the standards at the end of the probationary period. So again, it's something to think about. What are the needs of your students, your school program? And you can have differences for different categories of students, this program versus this program, et cetera. Okay? As far as developing your academic plan, we don't give you required data that's necessary to be included in that particular plan. So you have a lot of flexibility. We hope it's not just financial aid. We know you guys wear lots of hats, have lots of other duties as assigned, right? This is one where we hope you get to share this with your academic folks, the advisors, their mentors, because they're often the ones that really know what's going on with these individual students within their programs. But again, we don't dictate what that looks like, how these plans are developed, who oversees them. So again, you have flexibility in that process. As mentioned, again, probation is only one payment period. Why is that key? That's really key because at the end of that one payment period where they're on probation, okay, either one of two things is going to be true. Either they're meeting SAP now, which we hope, they meet the general standards, or they're meeting the plan requirements if you've placed them on a plan, and that plan is ongoing. So that plan is several payment periods down the road. So they're meeting the requirements of that specific plan. If you check less frequently than every payment period, remember, this is one of the areas, though, where you have to check at the end of the probationary period. So even though you might check once annually for students in good standing, this is one of those situations where you're going to have to check at the end of probation, which may not fall neatly within your annual checkpoint. So you have to make sure you're aware of that as you're working with your students. Here's another Q&A from the Program Integrity Q&A webpage under SAP. It talks about academic plans. So what do we call a student, or what status is a student if at the end of the probationary period, because it can only be one payment period, they're meeting the requirements of the academic plan? Technically for us, we consider that student to be in good standing, right? Because they're meeting the requirements of the plan. Once you put them on a plan, you're always checking them against the requirements of that plan until that plan ends. That's one of the reasons why, for the most part, academic plans tend to be several payment periods long. What if you only have an academic plan that's one payment period? You can do that, but what happens if they don't meet the general SAP standards. They might be meeting the academic plan requirements, but if they're still not meeting the general SAP standards, what happens at the end of that probationary period? They're not eligible because they're not meeting the standards and the plan doesn't continue. So what do they have to do to continue? They'd have to appeal again. So be careful on the length. This is where sometimes those advisors and academic folks can help when you're developing these plans to make sure it's long enough to really meet the needs of that student to get them where they need to be. Because that's what the idea of the plan is, right? To pull up their requirements such that they can now meet the general standards. So in this particular Q&A, again, once they meet the plan requirements, they are considered in good standing. Now, I know a lot of schools still want to call them probationary in their system, and that's okay. For system purposes, sometimes you have to do that. Maybe you're monitoring them a little more frequently and so forth. That's okay. I just wanted you to know from our standard, they're actually considered in good standing, and technically you could check them at your normal checkpoints for students meeting SAP. We also have this question, and in fact, Annmarie brought this up as well. Remember that the maximum time frame is appealable. Right? And this was actually mentioned in our Federal Register because a lot of schools had some questions and comments about that. So when you develop an academic plan, the question is, can it actually go beyond the 150% point? And the answer is yes, it can, because that maximum time frame is appealable. So you can actually go a payment period 2, 3, 4 beyond, as long as the student, of course, continues to meet the requirements of that academic plan. People have often asked, well, how many times can I place a student on probation? Our regulations don't restrict the number of probation. That can occur. But remember, anytime someone gets placed on probation, what has to happen? They have to appeal. It has to be approved. And then one of two things has to be true. Mathematically possible to meet the standards at the end of the payment period, or you place them on an academic plan. Some schools have asked, well, can I limit the number of probationary periods? Yes, you may. You have a lot of flexibility. I have schools that say one probation or one appeal attempt, if you will, throughout your academic career at our school. Some schools might say maybe once per program. Some may say two times, 3 times. Whatever you want to do that's acceptable, that's fine. Just make sure it's clear in your policy what your probation process is and any limits that there might be. Speaking of appeals, we have to remember that with an appeal, this is a student who is given a second chance, right? This is someone who technically is not meeting SAP. And we have to remember, I know you know this, sometimes the students don't, right? It's not like we're asking them to have a 4.0. Right? You've already established lower standards they need to meet just to stay eligible, and they're below those. So they're technically not eligible. So they're now coming to you, and you have to carefully evaluate them to decide if we're going to continue to give them taxpayer dollars as they're progressing through their program. So we have some specific rules that talk about you have to ask them, why did you fail? Why were you not successful? And what are you going to do differently? What's going to change to allow you to succeed? Right? Unfortunately, we've seen some of our repeat offenders, right, out there, unfortunately, that struggle, and we want to help them and make sure that they're really going to succeed as they're going forward. Remember that when we're appealing, we're looking at special and mitigating circumstances. Typically, it's circumstances outside their control. You know, we can give you lots of stories. Annmarie and I were both in compliance, the good old days, as program reviewers. But I can tell you that, you know, we had one school where they actually had listed as one of their items of what qualified as potential mitigating circumstance, and it said they could check a box that says, I was immature. Okay, wasn't that like every college student I've ever known, right? Especially all the guys, for sure, but, right? And that was it. There was, you know, I don't know how you support that either. You know, get a statement from mom and dad, oh yeah, this kid's immature for sure, right? So the reviewers obviously started looking at this, and every other one, immature. You They wrote the school up, and hundreds of thousands of dollars later, as they're working with the school, they corrected their policy. So we have to be careful about that SAP policy. It is not an automatic. It's not a rubber stamp. A lot of times reviewers, one of the things they may ask for is not who you've approved. Who have you not approved? What does that look like? Right? They want to make sure you're enforcing these policies, and that's important. We don't define what office or group oversees your appeals. Some of you, unfortunately, the buck stops with you, right? I'm everything. I am the final say. That's a lot of pressure, not to mention everything else you're trying to do. I have a lot of schools that try to work with committees, groups of people, right? Share the knowledge, share the wealth. So you're welcome to do that. I do recommend financial aid be involved with that process. I had one school where financial aid wasn't on the committee, had nothing to do with the appeals. Well, you're the only one who probably knows about SAP, so make sure you're at least advising, right? You could have tiers. I've seen, here's appeal 1, here's appeal 2. A lot of times they want to pick up the phone and they're calling the president. Hey, I was denied. That mean financial aid office said I couldn't get aid, and the president says, no, I will work this out for you. Give this student aid. Well, if that's not built into your policy and the appeal structure stops at that committee, that's it. But if you want to have a second level or a third level, go for it. Build it into your policy, right? It's there for a reason. Anytime a student gains eligibility or loses eligibility, you need to provide notification to your students. Hey, you're being placed on warning. If you're not careful, you may lose eligibility. This is what you're going to have to has to happen. Hey, you've now been suspended. Hey, you've regained your eligibility. Here's the process now to work through that. So you need to notify them. The one thing we do say is for non-Title IV students, so those students who aren't receiving any Title IV aid, you do not have to notify them. If they had been receiving Title IV aid, they would be placed on warning or they would have been suspended. That's up to you, right? You can if you want to, but if they're not receiving Title IV aid, there's not a requirement for that. You also get to dictate how many appeals. Right? I have schools that say 1 appeal while they're at school. Some have 2, 3, right? So you have, again, some flexibility. And finally, we often get questions about amnesty or forgiveness. And we have to remember that in Title IV, in any area, we don't have forgiveness or amnesty. The only automatic in SAP is the warning. If you have a warning period and it's allowed, they can automatically be placed on a warning. There's no appeal. But as far as forgiveness or amnesty, I know on the academic side, a lot of times the schools may have a process based on some situation with that student where they just want to remove a whole semester. Poof, David was never there. Well, that's great for the school side. For Title IV, we still have to factor in those hours. We have to factor in those grades, right? It's cumulative. Doesn't matter if they've sat out for a period. Doesn't matter, if they paid cash or if the school has forgiven certain courses or grades. It's still factored in for Title IV, and that's where a challenge comes in on the financial aid side, right, or on the SAP side, because you have to have a way to still capture those, right? So we want to make sure that you're aware of that. And then finally, we just have a few slides addressing a few other policy guidance that has occurred that has not yet made it into the formal Q&A website, but we often get, especially myself as a training officer, just wanted to point out a few hot areas. One of them is, and I kind of mentioned this briefly, what if you have a student here in this example where they've been into school for 3 payment periods, 3 semesters, and each semester they did horrible. We'll pretend it's my brother, okay, because he did horrible. He was not getting Title IV aid, though, for those 3 semesters. Had he been, he would have been placed on warning in that 2nd semester. So the question the school says is, well, now in semester 4, the student says, I want Title IV. And the school says, well, you've been struggling. Have you already used up your warning period or not? And the answer is yes, he has. Just because he wasn't receiving Title IV aid doesn't mean that the warning period didn't occur. Remember I said earlier, you don't have to notify them of that if they're not getting Title IV aid. That's your choice. But that warning period has been used up. Prior periods, whether they receive Title IV aid or not, do impact their SAP. So this student, if they were to obtain Title IV aid, would have to successfully appeal and be placed on probation. What about pass-fail grades? A lot of times programs may have a couple of courses you can take pass-fail. It can be a bit of a challenge, especially with the grades and how it gets factored into the GPA. Policy has very clearly said that for pass-fail, they do not have to be counted in the qualitative measurement as long as they are factored into the quantitative measurement, the pace of progression. So often that can help in that measurement process. And then academic plans. We had talked about that for a little bit. I mentioned that the academic plan has to have a specific endpoint. And schools have said, well, what does that mean? Well, it would really be great if it was a date, some very specific point in time where the plan ends. If not such a specific date, then maybe something more specific like, well, it will go to the end of the third semester or the second quarter, or maybe the anticipated graduation date that's established for that student. But it has to have some specific endpoint. It can't be open-ended. Okay? It can't go forever. Remember, we're giving them a second chance, so it has to be pretty defined. And then we hope each time you're evaluating their academic plan that they're continuing to move their measurements up. Okay? One thing I'll point about academic plans is make sure that your requirements are enhanced enough to pull them up to those cumulative requirements, right? If your GPA is a 2.0, I have schools that have an academic plan that says, oh, well, you have to have a 2.0 every time we measure you under the academic plan. Well, if I get exactly a 2.0 every time you check me under the academic plan and I have a 1.8, I'm never going to get to a 2.0. I'm never going to. So a lot of times you have to be more restrictive in the academic plan. And that's not a bad thing. Remember, they're just trying to meet the minimums. And technically they're not even eligible, but you've given them a second chance through this appeal process. What about regaining eligibility? So we've had this. Speaking of academic plans, a lot of times the plans are more restrictive. They have to be, right, to pull them up to those minimum SAP standards. Well, what happens at the end of a period, the end of an evaluation checkpoint, the student doesn't meet your academic requirement, your academic plan requirements, but they now meet the general SAP standards. Schools have said, I don't know, are they eligible or not? The answer is yes, they are. Because what's the ultimate goal of the academic plan? It's to get them to the general SAP standards. So often what I'll tell schools is make sure in your academic plan policy, just stress, you will again regain eligibility at the point where, or will continue to be able to receive Title IV aid at the point where you continue to meet the academic plan requirements or meet the general SAP standards. And then finally, we've had some questions around transcripts, those wonderful transcripts, right, that just pop up all over the place, but never when you actually would like them to. So what happens when you get that wonderful transcript smack dab in the middle of a payment period or a term? And maybe it doesn't look so good. And you're like, oh my gosh, I've already given them all the aid for this term. What do I do? Policy has clearly said that you can apply it to the next evaluation checkpoint for SAP purposes. So remember, SAP is typically forward-looking. So at the point when you evaluate them, if there's any kind of penalties or sanctions you have to take against a student, it's going forward, it's not back. So it tends not to be retroactive. So in this case, you could apply it the next time you evaluate the student's grades and pace. And then finally, a couple of resources and references. Annmarie definitely mentioned the FSA assessments under tools for schools, not just for SAP, lots of great categories out there. Please take advantage of that. It's updated every year. You may find other topics you want some assistance with. And let's face it, this allows you to do checks and balances, to kind of review yourself. Who would you rather find an SAP issue, us or you, right? So take the time to do that. FSA Handbook Volume 1, Chapter 1 does further explain our SAP regulations. And then as we've been mentioning throughout the presentation, a lot of the Q&As come directly from the Q&A webpage, and the link is provided here on the slide for you as well. We do update it periodically, and we'll add some questions here and there, so make sure you periodically take a look at it. And I'll be honest, there's probably a good 40 or 50 Q&As out there for SAP, and a lot of times schools will ask me questions, and I just cut and paste right from the Q&A, so you'd be surprised sometimes how much guidance is already out there for our schools. And then as far as contact, especially if we're not able to address all of your questions today, or if something else comes up about the training, feel free to contact us. I don't know why I put my information up there. I should have just put Anne-Marie's, but you have both our information there. It's easy to get a hold of us, firstname.lastname@ed.gov, and there are our phone numbers. With that said, we are done with the formal slides, but we do want to give you time if you have any questions. We have microphones in the front of the room, 1, 2, and 3. Feel free to come up and ask some questions. We have about a little over 20 minutes as far as the actual session goes. And we'll do our best to help answer your questions. Microphone number 2, right in the middle.
Hi, good afternoon. The school that I'm involved with at present time is a credit hour semester school. Their crediting agency from the state that they've been approved for works with clock hours, so now they're going to be having to change to clock hours to meet their state agency's requirement. And so that's what they're doing right now, changing everything, et cetera, and putting in all the requirements that they have to do with the Department of Ed. They asked me a question. I'm not sure I'm getting it right, so I may have to ask you again. They would like to know, for the agency's purposes, whether they can have academically clock hours SAP, but pay off financial aid credit hours SAP. Does that make sense? Or maybe I got the question slightly off. Can you have 2 SAP policies at the same time for a program?
Not for the same program. So if I'm hearing correctly, if the situation is that they're going to be dispersing and maybe determining student eligibility based on credit hours?
They want to do that for credit hours, but the criteria of the program has to then also be for clock hours. So,
well, for Title IV purposes, a program is going to be one or the other.
Right.
Right. So first we have to decide for Title IV, what must it be if there's a requirement on our end, and if there's not, then what is the school going to decide to make that program for Title IV? And then once
The state is requiring it, so then they have to be.
right. So if the state is saying it has to be clock hours, right?
then it has to be
then
clock
it will be
hours.
clock hours, and then for Title IV, dispersing, awarding, SAP, everything will be based on that.
Okay. Now, someone had said something at one of our meetings, which doesn't make sense as well, that when they put in to get certification for whatever program that they're discussing at present time, they list 2 programs. One is a clock hour and one is a credit hour. But they still have to be applied to, the policy has to be applied. Only one policy can be for the program. You can't have credit hours and clock hours, correct? For one program.
That's correct. What I think they may have been referring to is on the e-car.
Yes.
So that you have a program listed until everybody is taught out.
Right.
So that it's in credit hours and it's listed on there. If you take that off of your e-car before every student is finished with that program, and an auditor or a program reviewer came in and looked at it, they'd say, well, how are you awarding people under credit hours if you're not approved for credit hours? So you want to leave it on there until you're absolutely sure everybody's finished, and I think that may be of what they were referring
Right.
to.
I thought that as well, that they have to teach out that particular program. But going forward, let's say in January or whatever, for the new program, that it can only be one or the other. It
Correct.
cannot be clock hours and credit hours at the same time, and that's what I said.
Correct.
Right, so they might, and if you're teaching out that, so for the program that stays credit until they're all gone, if the state allows them to do that, maybe that SAP, well obviously that SAP policy would be based on credit, but then the new students where you have to go clock hour, their SAP will be different because it's based on clock hours, and they can be separate that way. But once you just have one normal program and everyone's taught out, it's one or the other. It's got to be all clock hour or all credit.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
We'll go over to microphone 3, and then we'll go over back to 1.
Thank you. You were specifically speaking about in the appeals process, you cannot approve if it's not mathematically possible for the student to be successful unless you put them on a plan. However, sometimes we have approved a student but advised them it's not mathematically possible coming to their completion, there's progress, but we'll just make them appeal again once we get to that point at their next SAP review. Is that okay or no? We have to put them on the plan.
Yeah, so if they're not placed on an academic plan and it's not mathematically possible, then the appeal can't be approved. They can't be placed on probation because one of two things has to be true. Either it's mathematically possible, and if it's not, then you have to put them on a plan.
Okay, I have more questions. I'll wait.
Number 1?
Hi. I'm a little confused with the max time and the pace because I understood that those were tied together, and if my pace of completion was 80%, then my max time could not be 150%.
That's correct.
That you guys have given out incorrect information, not you particularly,
Okay.
but we've got conflicting information out there. Can you please put that on a slide somewhere or in your Q&As because that's not very well known.
Okay, I thought we had done pretty well in terms of bringing those two together, but
In this presentation, yes.
Okay.
But you can ask the feds a question and you
Yes.
don't get that same answer.
okay, I appreciate that feedback. We'll see what we can do on that.
Thank you.
I just wanted to get clarification on what you're considering the end of the second academic year, because at one point the slide said regardless of their enrollment status, it was at the end of 4 semesters, and then you said 4 full-time semesters. So which one is it? Because if I have a lot of part-timers who might take them 4 years to get a 2-year degree. So at what point are you considering them the end of their second academic year?
We're looking at the number of terms regardless of their enrollment status.
So even if they're like 16 credits at the end of 2 years, that's the second academic year?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Hi there.
Hello.
So I have a question about academic plans. I kind of was thinking her question might be the same, but so if for probation it's not mathematically possible for them to get to the pace or the standards, if we put them on academic plan, is it that they have to have it has to be mathematically possible for them to get back to the standards before they graduate on the academic plan as well? No. Okay.
No.
Okay, good.
Yeah, you set up your plan such that if it has to go beyond the max time frame, that's still okay because again, that's appealable as well. But you're going to put them on pace so that at some point, a specific point as you've defined in the future, that they will meet the standards and hopefully graduate.
Okay, so
And
if
is-
they end up graduating before they meet the
That's okay,
standards,
too.
that's okay.
That's great. But as David mentioned earlier, that is your opportunity to really establish almost an alternate SAP policy for that student. It should be customizable, though. It should be very specific in terms of explaining to them what they need to do. And so some people plot it out every term. We expect you to do this by the end of this term, this by the end of this term. And they plot out kind of their remaining periods. And again, if they exceed it, that's wonderful. But at least it shows them a definite end point of we expect you to finish by this point.
Okay, thank you.
3?
Hi, I actually have another question about the second year phrasing requirement. As you indicated, regardless of whether they are full-time or part-time, it's defined as 4 semesters, correct? Okay, so when we were building our SAP policy, we used information from the online FSA training, and I just want to clarify from the information that's listed on here, because in the example it gives, it talks about a student completing 1 to 30 credit hours could have a 1.6 GPA, and then 30 to 59 could have a 1.8. So that's just assuming the student is doing 15 hours a semester. You can't actually have a credit hour range. Is that correct?
No, one of the things to remember with that is, so we say, and this is a little separate SAP regulation, separate from our normal 66834, but when you check at the end of that 4th semester, we say you have to have a 2.0 or equivalent to that, or meet the requirements for your standards for graduation. If you have a graduated GPA process, and at the end of the 4th semester, that student has a 1.8, but that 1.8, based on the number of credits they've earned, is acceptable based on your graduated process, then they're fine.
Okay. So if in that example, student has to have a 2.0 to graduate, but our academic standing policy is if you have 30 to 59 credit hours, you must have a 1.8. So it's okay to align our SAP policy with that, even though at the end of their second year, they're not meeting a 2.0, which is required for graduation. Is that right?
Correct, because
Okay.
it's not the actual GPA you need to graduate, it's the
Okay.
standards to still be considered in good standing
Good academic
to
standing.
graduate.
Okay,
right.
perfect. Thank you.
Hi, I have 2 quick questions. The first question is about the timing of the academic progress review annually. Would it be possible for a school to review at different times depending on when the student's academic year is ending? For instance, if an undergraduate student is taking summer classes versus one that's not, can we review SAP for the student that is taking undergraduate classes in the summer at the end of the summer term for their annual progress review?
So you have a policy where you'll check annually, it's just at what point do you check annually?
Right. We check annually everybody around the end of the spring semester, but we have run into a problem recently with students that are enrolled for summer, because then at that point they may already be enrolled at that time that we're reviewing SAP, and then that becomes their probation period if they're not making SAP, and they have to appeal after they've already started the semester. So in that kind of situation, would we be able to review those students at the end of their academic year, which technically wouldn't be until the end of their summer classes if we review them all as summer trailers for student aid?
When we say once a year, it's got to be consistent on all students, and that's cherry picking groups.
Yeah. Yeah.
In thinking it through quickly, I think part of what we've said is about being consistent and not cherry-picking groups. Now, I guess it would depend on how you define that and how much you know about their enrollment in advance. But I'm thinking that typically we would say you have to define a point that is the same for everyone, and you're not necessarily going to know who all's enrolled for summer and who's not in enough time to pick that out. So we would typically expect you to say, we're going to check at the end of spring and then have it be spring. Or you could say, we're going to check everybody at the end of summer and then check everybody there.
And then just do everybody then.
Right, regardless of whether
Yeah.
they're enrolled in summer courses or not. I think that would be your safest bet.
Okay, thank you. The other question that I had was regarding the academic plan, one of the last slides that you had talked about. There's some guidance on the NASPA website. I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but it states something that pretty much conflicts with what you guys just said, which is that if the student isn't meeting the terms of their academic plan at the end of a probation semester, that they are not eligible for federal aid if they are meeting the school's regular SAP standards because they didn't meet the terms of the academic plan. Is that something that's changed recently?
No, our guidance is correct.
Okay. All right, thank you.
We trumped NASPA, but we'll bring it back.
Okay, thank you.
Who was it?
Number 3?
I have 2 questions. I don't know how quick they are. I have a question about repeat coursework versus amnesty. So we have a graduated GPA. our GPA policy is that we follow the school's GPA policy. And then our PACE policy is, everything we've ever accepted to the program. So the school's GPA policy, on the academic side of the house, is that if a student repeats a course, the grade gets replaced in their GPA.
You're right.
Okay. 'Cause somebody told us we were wrong at something else,
Right.
and so I'm asking the feds instead.
You're right. So this is one of those areas where it can appear that there's a conflict there in our rules, because on the one hand, we're saying there's no amnesty, there's no forgiveness, cumulative, factor everything in, but then as Annmarie pointed out, in your policy, you address how do you handle repeat coursework, and we very clearly state in our Q&As, you decide how it impacts both the qualitative and quantitative. So I have schools that might average the courses, they take the highest one, they take them both. Whatever you do, that's fine, just be clear in your policy.
As long as it's in the policy.
Yes.
Okay, and then my other one, you mentioned transcripts that come in the middle of a semester. What about things like grade changes? That's an internal change. Would you expect that we would check SAP at the point we became aware of the grade change, recheck SAP for the current semester, or would it just be fine to catch them at the end of at the next checkpoint? We check every semester, but.
I would check them again at the end of the next checkpoint, because again, we're always saying that it is at the end of a payment period that you can check SAP.
Okay.
I would expect that grade changes are probably infrequent, and I think it would be fine to wait just as you would with a transcript and follow that same guidance.
Okay, thank you.
One?
Question about the academic plans and probationary periods. So you said that a student cannot receive Title IV aid after one payment period of being on probation unless they're meeting the SAP standards or they're on an academic plan and they're meeting the standards of that academic plan after one payment period. So if they're meeting the standards of that academic plan after one payment period, you said they're back in good standing for your purposes. Okay. So if the payment period, if the academic plan though is say 3 payment periods long, if after the end of the second payment period they're not meeting the standards of the academic plan again, and they're also not meeting SAP standards, are they eligible for a warning period again if your school allows warnings, or are they, or can you suspend them immediately at that point?
Because they're back in good standing. Right. Yeah, it would be up to your policy,
Okay.
Because they are considered back in good standing for our purposes. So if you allow multiple warning periods, that's fine. If not, they'd have to appeal and be placed on probation.
But can we restrict the number of warning periods specifically for students on an academic plan?
Yes. You
Yes.
can.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Number 2?
Yeah, this is a follow-up to the repeat coursework question, and you may have already answered this, but repeat coursework then on PACE and max time frame, is that up to the institution? Tell me how repeat coursework affects PACE and max time frame.
That, again, that's where we're trying to be overly generous and overly flexible, where we allow you to determine it and put it into your policy.
So I can count both courses as attempted and completed, or I
You may.
can slice and dice, however is going to be
Yes.
best for my students.
As David mentioned, some schools do an average. Some schools say we only take the final attempt. Some schools say we take the highest attempt. Some schools say we take all, and all of those are permitted. Again, we strongly encourage you, though, to think that through in terms of what it does for your particular population and then put that into your policy. I always recommend, if you're thinking about changing a policy, first of all, make sure you put the date that you changed it so that you're applying that consistently and evenly, but also try to do a sample of a percentage of your population, a small percentage, but do a sample of your students and see what it would do under the old and see what it would do under the proposed, and make sure you really like it and you can live with it before you actually make that change. Number 3.
Hi again. I just want to confirm if appeal approval can be discretionary, as in the student addressed why they failed and what's changed. However, using our discretion, we still feel per their grades and per what they've written, it doesn't line up, and we don't believe they could be successful, so we deny that appeal. Can you confirm that that is appropriate?
Yes.
Okay. And then twofold, can we deny it just based on the standards that they don't address the why or what's changed? But say they don't address that in the appeal, but they've listed a couple things, maybe really short, and then, but their grades, are pretty close. And so you're like, I want to give them a chance.
It's part of the regulation that they need to address those items.
Okay.
Now, some people will encourage them to go back and rewrite their appeal.
Right.
For example, if you don't have enough information, that you are saying, okay, we need the following information in order to fully consider your appeal. And that's fine, but again, that's all at your discretion.
Okay.
But you need to make sure that they include those before you are approving them.
Right. And then just one quick question. Talking about plans and how they can be longer than a payment period, can we do plans that are shorter than? Say you need to earn an A grade in your first class back, and if you don't, we're going to kick you out.
No, they need to be at least one payment period in length, because remember, as David said, we're evaluating based on at least a payment period at all times. So if you're going to give them the opportunity and you feel that they're worth that opportunity, you need to give them that much time to straighten things out.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm from a graduate school, professional school, and wanted to find out if a student change programs from a graduate to maybe a professional program. They were not making SAP in the graduate program. Now they are in the DO program. Of course, they are making SAP, but then suppose they go back to the graduate program.
That's where the no amnesty thing comes in. You have to consider.
Yeah, so if they, well, first of all, when they transfer to the new program, it depends how your policy handles the transfer, switching between programs. You could factor in only those, at a minimum, you have to factor in those courses that transfer in, but you could choose to factor in, all or no. So sometimes schools are able to reset SAP when they switch programs, that's fine. But if I go back to a program, then remember those prior courses aren't forgiven,
Right.
As we talked about, so they're still going to be factored in. So whatever status I was at, I'm still at when I come back.
That's right. So a reset for the new program is acceptable.
Correct, for the new one, right.
Right.
Yep.
Thank
Depending
you.
how your policy is written, yeah.
Right.
I think last question and then.
Hi, this is for maximum time frame. If a student is pursuing dual majors and they reach the 150% based off of one published program, can we terminate them at that point and then ask them to appeal based off of not reaching their second major?
You may, yes.
But we can, so we don't have to add the hours. We can just use it based off of one program.
No, you're certainly permitted to do it in that way, and just let them know that this is part of their appeal process, and how they would do that is fine.
Thank you.
All right, well, seeing no other questions here, we appreciate your time this afternoon. And if you do have other questions, by all means, you can find myself, at least, at the Ask a Fed booth. And we do have a couple other SAP sessions tomorrow and Thursday as well, if you want to send any of your colleagues to learn more about satisfactory academic progress.
Thank you all very much for coming.